Good evening, friends. One more time, my name is Bobby Trice, Program Assistant for Quaker Outreach, and I am running tech this evening. I just wanted to give a little overview of tonight's event, Listening and Discerning Legislative Priorities. We'll start by introducing our panelists, Deb Hejl and Christine Ashley. We'll hear briefly about the history and impact of FCNL's priorities process from Christine, and then Deb and Christine will both share stories and highlights of the priorities process from their experiences. We'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. Like I said earlier, please submit your questions through the Zoom chat at the bottom of your Zoom window. And finally, we will conclude with a tour of FCNL's website pages with resources on the priorities process and how you can discern and submit those legislative priorities. And with that, I will turn it over to Christine and Deb.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I'm so pleased and honored that you chose to give this time to be with friends and have this really important conversation. Tonight, we are going to be talking and hopefully having a vibrant conversation about ways that we can include more and hopefully diverse members of our Quaker communities to actually help us discern the legislative priorities for the 117th Congress. So on behalf of the 76-year-old organization, your Quaker Lobby, Friends Committee on National Legislation, we are asking for your worship and discernment about our legislative priorities for the next Congress. This is an important election year, as you know, and the consequences for the country are going to be dramatic, irregardless of the outcome. Your feedback and participation in this legislative priorities process, starting from January now, 2020, all the way through April 15th, 2020, that's your time frame to see how you may gather with friends and sit in discernment and consider leadings and concerns which you would like to submit to FCNL for the policy committee to consider for the 117th Congress. From its inception, the Friends Committee on National Legislation has relied on these meetings and churches, your meetings, your churches, to ground our work in the concerns of friends. And our process of asking friends to consider every 2 years which issues should be the focus of their lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. It connects our advocacy strongly to our testimonies, our values, and our witness in the world as friends. So as we seek to uphold these values and advance those values in this very challenging political environment, we ask your meeting, church, or friends to reflect on these questions again. How are friends called to influence our government today? What issues should be the priority for our advocacy efforts? And where is the Spirit leading us as a body, stemming from the Religious Society of Friends? So we really hope that your community can take part in this nationwide discernment between now and April 15, 2020. And this discernment will be around the issues FCNL should focus on the next Congress, the 117th Congress. I want to stop there as I think we want to get on to the meat of this program. The interesting thing about the work that we're talking about is there is no prescribed way in which we say this is how this discernment needs to happen. And indeed, we're friends. We know, like, all of our meetings in our communities are individuated in many different ways. We have lots of different voices. And indeed, this may be a wonderful opportunity to try to look for including more elements of our friends community in this important space and time that you carve out, either doing second hour or first hour or meeting for business or committee work. So I'm going to stop there because really the star of the show is Deb Hejl, who is a member of our general committee. She's also a standing committee member in the field committee, which is devoted to increasing, strengthening, growing, and nurturing our advocacy efforts as a body of Quakers and friends around the country. We are more than a building in Washington, D.C. We our FCNL. So Deb, I'm hoping that you'll spend the next 10 minutes or so speaking from your own lived experience about how to go through this process within Quaker community.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be a part of this process. I have participated in numerous priority setting meetings through the years in a number of different ways in several different meetings. So I wanted to just share some of my experiences with you tonight so that it might get your mind beginning to work on ways that this could be most effective in your own friends meeting or church. The first thing that I really would like to emphasize is that the process in your meeting needs to be ought to be spirit-led. That this is not a political meeting. It's not a meeting where we sit around and just talk about strategy. We are waiting for the discernment to say, over the next 2 years, what direction should we in FCNL be taking toward trying to set national policy? The first technique that my meeting, and this is when I was a member, I was attending Indianapolis First Friends meeting, is we did a called meeting over dinner. And I expect that many meetings have the same experience. If you bring food out, that people warm up, they come together, they loosen up a little bit, and that this is a good way for people to, to share their thoughts. There were good things and things to improve with this. Part of the issue is that for us, it was not as inclusive as we would have liked. Because it was a special called meeting in the evening, not a part of our regular meeting for worship experience. Fewer people attended, so that I think the discernment was among a smaller group. So it has its pluses and its minuses. The next thing that we did was we had a special meeting of adult first day school, so that people came together in their regular time of gathering. And we had a number of adult first day school programs. We came together in a joint meeting to discuss what our priorities ought to be and to really discern this spiritual process. Our concern with that approach was that it was time constrained. Everybody had to come at a certain time, everyone had to go off to other activities at a certain time, so that it was a little frustrating at times to come up with necessarily our final thoughts on it, so that a smaller committee then ended up putting the ideas together. At the last priorities process, I've moved to Pennsylvania, and I'm a member of Gwynedd Friends meeting. And we tried to bridge those two approaches. And the first concern that we addressed was how to be as inclusive as possible. So we took the FCNL policy statement, The World We Seek, and we made 4 different poster boards and listed the 4 we seeks at the top. I brought a visual aid to show you what these look like. So that if you can see, this is what the poster is. This is the "We Seek an Earth Restored." It was a long poster, and then people were given colorful Post-it notes, and that if your concern was a part of seeking an earth restored, you would stick your issue onto this poster. Now, the advantage of this was that it sort of sorted some of our discernment. But also, we had these posters out for a full month before we met in community to discern what our priorities ought to be. So that even for people who were not able to attend the discernment process, they were able to have input into what the meeting ended up deciding. We also involved our middle school and our high school friends in this process, and we found that some of their issues were very different than what some of the adult issues were, so that it really widened and enriched the discernment. At the end of the month of having these posters out with the Post-its all over them, two of us took the posters home, and we tried to group topics together so that we were able to come up with a list of possible issues for us to put forth, and it narrowed then our discussion. After meeting for worship, we had a called meeting, but it was at the same time, so people were already at the meeting house. And we met for about an hour and a half, and really felt very comfortable with the issues that came forth from this process. The bottom line is that there is no one right way to do this. You have to know what works with your community, what the time constraints are, but one of the things that I absolutely love about this process, it's one of my favorite things at FCNL, because it really is a ground up expression of what we think FCNL ought to be working on. And as Christine said at the beginning, we are FCNL. It's not staff telling us what is important. It's the monthly meetings through the discernment process telling staff what Quakers are concerned about in the coming 2 years. So, we can, this evening, we can discuss a number of different possibilities, brainstorm a little bit. I'm sure that there are a million other ways that this could happen.
Oh, I think I was muted. Bobby is all the control. Thank you very much, Deb. That was really inspiring, and it was so creative. And I loved how you really surfaced this theme of how do we engage more voices in this process, in this consideration of what do we as a meeting community, that's the youngest to the most eldest, feel is important, weighs on our heart, is a leading concern, and needs the advocacy and the guidance of FCNL staff to make important policy and legislation in Washington, D.C. I loved how Deb talked about how, FCNL is encouraging friends, engage with the priorities process in whatever way feels most appropriate to your gathering. And I have a couple different stories that also emphasize this same idea. Again, emphasizing that it is the participation of friends and meetings and churches that is absolutely essential to making this 76-year-old Quaker lobby who and what we are, from the issues we work on to the way we focus on building relationships and looking for that of God in everyone we talk to. We are a nonpartisan organization We are often looking at crafting legislation, and we are often blocking legislation that we think does not need to be passed. So what we're doing today in politics and in actually ascertaining what this organization needs to work on, it's incredibly important and incredibly unique and increasingly rare, I think, in organizations where we look for our grassroots, our foundation spirit to rise to the level of organized work to make the world we seek. The last thing I want to say before I maybe share a story or two is meetings will have received this particular book, which Deb referred to. It's a foundational legislative policy, and it was recently revised at FCNL's most recent annual meeting in 2019. And this too was a product of friends across the country, about 126 meetings and churches participating in reading and discerning what was still needed to be lifted up in our legislative foundation. So what friends are going to be receiving, then that's meeting contacts, that's your meeting in church, and it also should include anybody who has submitted priorities in the past. You'll be receiving a packet in the mail with the resources that you need in order to participate in this process. And a little bit later, Bobby is going to show us where you can get all of these resources online, as well as where you can submit your priorities. Now, I'm going to repeat several times that your time frame is now through April 15th. And we really have to stick to that time frame for this process, as our policy committee, which is made up of members of our general committee, goes on retreat several times to sit in discernment and consider all of the submissions that friends have gathered and put forth to be considered for the next legislative process, the 117th Congress. So it's a lengthy process that culminates at our next annual meeting. And I'll give you some information about that at the end of this time that we're sharing together as well. So I have several stories that I think for me are really interesting, and they're really different. I want to just do a shout out to Bobby, who you can't see on the screen right now. He's on technology, and he just came back from the New England Yearly Meeting Young Adult Friends Midwinter Retreat. And he went there and he participated in this really, it sounded like a very restorative retreat with a number of young people. And one of the workshop offerings was the priorities process. So Bobby and I think 5 or 6 other people gathered together, and they, out of the sense of their meeting, came up with their priorities. That group is still working on fine-tuning what it is they want to submit. But I'm so excited because, as far as I know, the first body to submit their priorities are going to be these 18 to 30-year-olds. And that is extremely exciting for FCNL and for the Religious Society of Friends. We are looking for the growth and the future of the Religious Society of Friends. And so we really would treasure the opportunities for our youngest to our teens, to our young friends and young adult friends, all the way up to you and me, I guess we're the oafs, to really be able to submit our concerns and leadings. I was really excited to hear 2 years ago about the fact that several meetings were bringing this process to junior friends' religious education. And the way that they were conducting the priorities process was a little bit more along the lines of the creative style that Deb was speaking about. It definitely was about deep listening to one another and listening to concerns that were rising, and then trying to articulate as a small body what is it that they want Quakers to work on. So that was really neat, and several of the meetings that did this process decided that the junior friends would facilitate their own process. Now, there have been meetings which actually have kind of an all meeting for business style. And sometimes that process can, last for that particular meeting for business. I've also heard of meetings for business which hold that process over. And there are some meetings who really look at taking the We Seek brochure and the 4 chapters and designating these chapters to people to read, to sit on, to contemplate, and then to engage in the process. You can download these brochures, and you can also request them of Bobby or me. We're happy to send your meeting 5 to 10 of these if that would be helpful. And you are able to, you can email us, Christine@fcnl.org, and I'm happy to get those out in the mail to you. I guess the final story that I think about that was really exciting to hear about, Indiana and just in Richmond has approximately 3 yearly meetings, and 2 churches in one meeting decided that they would gather and they would together come up with their priorities process. And they were quite surprised to see that they actually went through this process in about an hour. They projected the We Seeks on their wall, and then they settled into silence. And I wanted to read you the We Seeks just so that we all know what Deb and I are referring to. Part of the foundation of our legislative policy comes and stems from these 4 principles and values. We seek a world free of war and the threat of war. We seek a society with equity and justice for all. We seek a community where everyone's potential may be fulfilled. We seek an earth restored. So those are the kind of 4 grounding platforms, and as Deb was speaking, can often be used to help kind of sort and categorize concerns that may arise. I think I'm going to stop there and go on pause for a minute. I think we can do a time check, and I also want to give the floor back to Deb to see if there's anything else that you're thinking about right now in terms of stories or something that we have yet to elucidate in a more complete fashion. Oh, Deb, you're muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. I know one of the things that often comes up is as friends, we have many concerns that may be outside of the realm of FCNL. Remember that the Friends Committee on National Legislation is looking at issues that Congress can address. So for example, putting more money into local public schools tends to be even though there is national legislation around education, the funding of public schools comes from local communities. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the scope of FCNL's work. I found it very helpful in my discernment process to refer back to the legislative priorities of the previous Congress, because the way that they're worded and the way the policy committee takes these concerns and compresses them down to just a few, they have to be general enough that we can react to whatever legislation is going on the Hill, but they need to be broad enough that we can be inclusive. So those are 2 things that might help: keeping a national focus and using previous legislative priorities as a guide.
Oh yeah, we'll just keep Deb and I unmuted. Bobby is right now going to bring up the current legislative priorities. We're going to investigate this page a little bit further. It's fcnl.org/priorities. Yeah, Bobby, I wonder if you could bring that back up so we can see the current legislative priorities. And these are available on a PDF form. As you can see, you can download, and that may be a helpful way for friends to see what was currently in play and considered. There were some changes that were rather dramatic and very welcome and exciting. The paragraph that says friends are called to promote genuine equality of opportunity in communities in which everyone can safely live, learn, work, worship. And then it says, in each priority, we will identify, expose, and work to eliminate institutional racism, institutional sexism, and other forms of systemic discrimination. So some of the priorities, as you see, are very specific, and this was exciting because it really constitutes the underpinnings of some of the illnesses of our structures as being endemic in each and every one of these concerns. So Deb, if you want to just keep yourself unmuted, it's cool too. There was a question coming from Jay, who I think what Jay was speaking of was, hey, is there anything that is not really, doesn't have a good track record, like a way to do this that just really doesn't work well? You know, I think, Deb, you were kind of painting that picture like, hey, we try some things, some get to where we want to go as a community better than other ways. You know, if your sense is we want to make space for more voices to rise, you know, then you'll be thinking about process that may be a little bit different than, oh my gosh, it's April 10th and we need to get our priorities sent in. So it really depends on the body. We encourage you to engage with the priorities process in whatever way that's most appropriate for your gathering. And in a couple of minutes, we'll also share with you some resources that we have online that we offer friends as possible starting points for queries that you could potentially use during this process as well.
Yes, thank you so much, friends, for sharing your questions through the Zoom chat. We have several that have cropped up, so I will do my best to fit a few in here. First, we have one. Do friends often use an explicit worship sharing process?
I would say yes, because rather than just expectant waiting like we would have in a regular meeting for worship, we do have a goal, and the goal is to come up with legislative priorities so that the questions that focus our worship during the discernment process, I think, in are a form of worship sharing. One of the resources that's on the website for you to use are some scriptural quotes from earlier friends that will help you focus in on this, so that I think worship sharing very much is an appropriate process.
We are sending out resources for centering, and you may see this, as Deb says, that this is outcome based. And so there are a series of queries that we offer, and you may have your own queries. One of the queries that we provide in our resources for centering is as follows. Consider what seeking the kingdom of God means in the context of public policy. What societal conditions and public policies are inconsistent with truth as friends understand it? What areas do we need to focus on to increase agreement with God's character, values, intentions? So we do provide queries as well, which may help to streamline the worship sharing.
All right, we have another question. Please tell us more about how the policy committee proceeds to synthesize the many widely differing submissions.
You want to go for that, Deb, or do you want me?
I would rather you would, because I've never been on the policy committee.
I've never been on the policy committee too, so I will do my best. My understanding of the policy committee is that the submissions come in, and we have clerks who rotate through, and so the particular policy committee will decide, how are they going to sort, categorize, lean into, and consider. Like I said, they have a number of full weekend retreats. They also are. They also have all of the submissions to read before they come to the retreats, and there is a decidedly thoughtful process and tender process in really holding the various concerns and leadings that come through. I think what the body looks to is what will be presented to the board, the whole general committee, during annual meeting. And in fact, it is that group of over 186 folk who come to annual meeting, who sit in business, meeting for business, go through worship sharing and discernment themselves, and offer back their discernment as well. So it's a very considerate process. And I guess that's what I can share. I don't know. Deb, do you have anything else that you would add?
I think we have to take a number of things into account as well. We have certain expertise through the years. I mean, we have 76 now years of doing work on Capitol Hill, so that we want some continuity from year to year. But on the other hand, I think the policy committee is looking very much for new ideas. For example, I think the wording in the 116th priorities list around ending gun violence was much more pronounced than it was earlier because of the national concern over mass shootings, right? So that this evidently came up in the priorities process. The other thing
we
is,
actually have a former member of the policy committee in this conversation,
ooh,
who has raised his hand and says, I can speak to this from personal experience. So I would invite Bill Sweet to go ahead and offer your expertise.
Not sure that expertise is quite justified, but I was on policy for 6 years in the 1990s, and we did, and I was part of revising the priority statement 3 times and the policy statement once, and the policy and priorities were all in 1 year, which was suboptimal. And Christine did a very good job, I think, of saying what happens. All the information, all the submissions are given to all the committee members. And at least at that time, we met 4 times during the year for the weekend. We read them, we talked about them, we talked about how to discern in a Quakerly sense, the sense of the meeting, meaning all the Quakers submitting is sort of a meeting for worship, but there's not the direct interaction. So we talked a lot about how do you do this without voting? Oh, we've got topic X, we've got 73 votes for that, so that must be the most important. We tried very hard to deliberate, to look at this in a very spiritual and a very discerning manner. Went through in the 4 meetings, went through the iterations, writing and revising and reconsidering and so forth. I think I've gone on long enough. That's it.
Thank you so much. It's great to have somebody who's been in the room. And my understanding is that format is still maintained today, that there are approximately 4 meetings that happen between April 15th and it's going to be annual meeting. And I wrote down when annual meeting is this year. And now I'm not finding it. So we're going to have to go on with Bobby online to look to see. Because annual meeting is where we invite all friends and the general committee to come together to Washington, D.C. and participate in 4 days of advocacy, as well as worship sharing groups that continue to lean into the process. And on the screen right there, if you're thinking that this could be a fabulous way to meet with 350, 400 Quakers from across the Religious Society of Friends and worship together, it is something. So in 2020, it's going to be from November 12th to November 15th. We'll have another Zoom meeting that will talk to you more about annual meeting. But if you haven't experienced it, I would say it's joyful, it's restorative. It has often been described as a space where Quakers are astounded to experience the depth of worship in such a robust community. Do we have any other questions that are coming up through the Zoom chat?
We do. Let's see. We have one question. Do the panelists have any suggestions on how to engage the wider meeting when the FCNL priorities are mostly addressed by the Justice Committee?
Can you repeat it one more time?
Sure. Any suggestions on how to engage the wider meeting when the FCNL priorities are mostly addressed by the Justice Committee?
Well, can I leap in, Deb? Because I think that, again, if one of your values in this process is let's make space for additional other voices to rise, which may be those folk who aren't on the Justice Committee. The priorities process can be really wonderful because it's a level playing field, right? This is all worship. And there is no authority or right answer about what legislative priorities need to be addressed. The world is rather on fire right now. So there are many things that we can do. And in fact, since our inception, we've been working on nuclear disarmament. That is still a priority. And that's one that we will continue to work on. So I would say it may be that you have to think a little bit about how to construct an open sharing space so that friends feel comfortable in engaging in an area where they may not feel like experts, so to speak, but they have deeply held beliefs and concerns. Deb, do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's the inclusion that I think the process that we used with the We Seeks was the very best part of that, because we allowed people to put input, not just during the worship sharing itself, but a full month in advance. What are the issues that are near and dear to your heart? And people would write them down and put them on these little Post-its. And then what was also wonderful about that is not only did people get to share their personal concerns, but they got to see the concerns of other people. So that someone, if a middle school student would write down, I'm very concerned about gun violence, another member of the meeting who may be very involved in Quaker Earth Care Witness also understands that fear of gun violence is a real concern. So it was a way for us to talk to each other. It could be done on a bulletin board. It could be done during fellowship. It doesn't have to be, at least the beginning process doesn't have to be in a meeting for worship.
I know that one religious education classroom, which was for young friends, used the FCNL Love Thy Neighbor, No Exceptions bumper sticker, and basically said to the young people, draw a picture. What does that look like? And then that was then submitted as part of their inclusion in the process. And then adults and the more elder of the community studied and looked at those pictures and then tried to articulate in a verbal fashion, well, how does that teach us and how about public policies that might best advance the aspiration to recognize that of God in every person. So I thought that was really inventive, and it was inclusive, and it was a way for the entire body to really hone in on, a fundamental tenet of how we practice and what we practice as friends, that there's that of God in all of us.
Great, thank you so much. We also have another question here. Can you talk about how you balance ongoing concerns, such as nuclear disarmament, with the immediate concerns and dangers we see in this extraordinary political climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. We are blessed to have a robust staff here at FCNL, where we have approximately 52 staff people. We have a number of lobbyists who have individual portfolios which stem from the legislative priorities that you decide. So Anthony Wire, for example, is our nuclear disarmament lobbyist. He's incredible. And he hones into the whole kit and caboodle. And in other ways, we've got somebody who you may be receiving action alerts from right now, Hassan El Taib, who is our Middle East policy legislative lobbyist. And he hones into specific areas in Middle East policy that we see legislation needing to be crafted, blocked, or supported. So right now he is leading the work in Iran and deterring this march to war. And he also holds Israel-Palestine concerns and Yemen, Syria, you name it. So I think the thing that I've come to really appreciate the most is that while we have expertise in Washington, D.C., we know that we move the hearts and minds and legislation of from Congress because of our grassroots work. So it is all of us who may go through the priorities process and then decide, okay, so now there's something I know I can do, and I can do this in tandem with FCNL's expertise, and I can do this with the resources available through this organization. So, I would say that we're remarkably lucky to have grown into the robust, largest faith-based Quaker or faith-based lobby on Capitol Hill, and that's thanks to the support of friends.
Great. We have one final question. We still have a little bit of time, so send your questions to the chat if you have not had a chance to submit them yet. How is staff knowledge involved in the priorities process?
So Deb, are you looking at me?
I am.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. So certainly we have staff here who've got incredible expertise, and they have expertise on the Hill, they have relationships on the Hill, and they're well situated to make the deep dives. You know, I was actually talking to Kate Gould, who many of you know held the Middle East portfolio for years, and she was saying, what a remarkable time that we are living in right now. There's so much going on the Hill. There's so much that we need to block. There's so much that we can possibly support. And she really talked about how the work that we do is seizing the moment, sustaining the push for peace and justice over the long haul. And certainly we can see with the work that we did with the Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, which finally was signed into law in early 2019, you know, that was the culmination of years of effort from FCNL and FCNL lobbyists. So I will say that FCNL doesn't take the easy way out. We lift up the work that needs to get done, and it's tough. And some of you on this line may be members of the advocacy team, and you know that last year we were working really hard to repeal the 2002 AUMF, the Iraq AUMF, and we felt like we were close to getting this approved in the NDAA in the end of the year, and didn't. And you know what was amazing is the fact that now, because of FCNL advocates, AUMF is not a four-letter acronym in mainstream media and culture. And this is because we pushed it to the top of people's consciousness. So I will say that we do lean into the expertise of the individual lobbyists, and we also know that that way opens, spirit rises, and we are nimble and flexible and able to be responsive to opportunities when they arrive.
I would say too that the relationship between staff concerns and the monthly meeting concerns is mutual and really symbiotic, if in a way that individual friends are inspired by the work of staff and want to participate. Staff are inspired by the local work of friends and the lobbying that we do in district, for example, so that there's an ebb and flow that goes back and forth. I mean, I can't imagine that nuclear disarmament will not be one of our priorities next year. But on the other hand, I have seen Seeking an Earth Restored grow as a concern of Friends. And if you look at the policy statement that was approved in 2019, that part of the policy statement was greatly expanded because of the concerns of Friends on the ground. So that relationship goes back and forth, I think.
So we do want to take a moment to introduce us again to the website where you can receive, review, print off all of the resources that we've been talking about. You can go to fcnl.org/priorities, and that will get you, there we are on the home page, fcnl.org. You could go to the search bar and just say priorities, or you can just do fcnl.org/priorities. And really, I'm hoping that what you've heard from both Deb and I is that we're saying our Quaker beliefs are relevant, they're sustaining us, they are impacting what we choose to do in our lives of advocacy and witness in the world. And there is room for Friends old and new to lift up this work. So again, you're going to be able to already jumpstart this process. Maybe you're already putting some time in your calendar for a second hour or first hour, or you may do a process that Deb talked about, how she made these posters and put them out in public places and made it very invitational for people to, over 4 weeks, to really think about, contemplate. I do know that some people utilize the We Seek document kind of like a book club before engaging in the priorities process. So again, you're going to be receiving in the mail, and so you should look out for it in your meeting, a cover letter, link to the online form from our priorities, guidelines for participating in the priorities, resources for doing this work. You'll also receive our current legislative priorities, and you'll receive one copy of The World We Seek. Again, if you want additional copies, feel free to email me at Christine, that's with the CH, at fcnl.org. Do we have time to go back to the site? Okay. So again, you can click to all of the resources. They're linked. You can scroll down and see The World We Seek right there. It says background. You can print that out if you so desire. I think actually we've got a PDF of that too. And we hope that what you take away from this evening is there are many ways that Friends can discern and submit these leadings and concerns. We think it is a vital underpinning and a source of integrity and sustenance for this Quaker lobby to receive these submissions from meetings. There is no other way, I believe, that we are as grounded and centered in the work we do than as going through this process every 2 years. It is Quakers who are deciding how we must marshal our bodies, hearts, and minds, our voices, and actually impact and influence Congress. And the direction is coming from Friends. I really hope that this evening has provided you with some kind of openings and maybe some excitement too about how this may open up some interesting conversational avenues and pathways for Friends in your meeting that may not arise in the body of the meeting, may happen more frequently in committees. Bobby, looking at the time check, are there any last questions or thoughts or concerns that you feel like we have not addressed that have come up?
There is one last question in the chat, and that is, how might Friends offer ideas for healing Congress?
We just had silent reflection in our front parlor here at the Quaker Welcome Center. It was one of the pinnacles, really, of having this space carved out 20 feet away from the Senate Hart Building. When we gather, we open our doors. We never know who shows up. And actually this evening, we had 2 young fellows from another faith-based organization come and join us, one who's never experienced meeting for worship before. And we started out the evening together that said, what a unique opportunity that we have to actually hold in the light and in love our members of Congress who need our good counsel and our ministry more than ever before. They need to know that we are standing there with them and we are offering good counsel and advice, and we're not going away. We're looking for the light of God within them as well. And we think that that is one of the most powerful things that we as Quakers can do at this pivotal time. We can engage in tough conversations. We can hold discomfort. We can continue conversations even when they're tough because we know how to hold the space to do that. So I wonder if that's something to think about. I know some meetings have, weekly peace vigils, and that's a way that has become like a traditional manner of witness. But it may be putting aside a special worship sharing for friends to actually hold in the light our government, our White House, our power brokers, who are more needing to hear the voices of peace and justice and love than ever before. Well, I would like to thank you all for coming and spending this time with us this evening. We will have this recording available for folk who could not attend this evening and registered. I was thinking, Deb, that I wanted to give over to you maybe the last word. You had submitted a beautiful poem that maybe we can't read out aloud here for the field committee meeting that you're coming to attend. Is there anything that rises up to you right now as kind of a closing for this body? And then maybe we can settle into a moment of silence.
I think that it's important to remember that we're doing God's work, and that we're not in this alone. It should feel very different than going to a political strategy meeting. I know when I come back from annual meeting, I feel really very rejuvenated, and hope that this process in your monthly meeting or your church will help rejuvenate people as well.
Thank you, friends, for the prophetic leadership that you and friends of the last 76 years have bestowed upon this organization and to Congress. We value and treasure this. It's what has garnered strength and power and impact for the 117th Congress coming up. I'm wondering if we can settle into a moment of silence together in gratitude for joining in this important conversation this evening. Thank you, friends. What a joy it was to spend time with you. And again, my name is Christine Ashley, the Quaker Field Secretary here at FCNL. And I more than welcome your emails with any outstanding questions or thoughts or requests for We Seek booklets. My email is christine@fcnl.org. Travel well, be safe, and looking forward to doing good work and making good trouble in 2020.
Thank you, friends.